Welcome back to the 1619 Project podcast. My name is Antonio Ruiz, and my friend over here is
Thomas Fields.
Thomas Fields. I knew your name. I just was trying to mess with you.
Okay.
So today we've got a really interesting subject, capitalism. And I wanted to start off with on page 166, when they talk about defining capitalism. And it's sort of, they talk about, this is obviously a capitalist society, but it's not that simple. They talk about what kind of capitalist society we are compared to a lot of other countries. And one of the things that keeps coming up, words that keep coming up is, for instance, it says it's a capitalist society. It's a fatalistic mantra that seems to get repeated to anyone who questions why America can't be more fair or equal. Around the world, there are many types of capitalist societies. Some are more equitable and some are more exploitive. Some more restrained and some more unregulated. When Americans declare we live in a capitalist society, a real estate mogul told the Miami Herald in 2018, when explaining his feelings about small business owners being evicted from their little Haiti storefronts, what they're often defending in our nation's peculiarly brutal version of capitalism, low road capitalism. The University of Wisconsin-Madison sociologist Joel Rogers has called it. In a capitalist society, and let's finish, capitalist society like ours, wages are depressed as businesses compete over the price, not the quality of goods, and so-called unskilled workers are typically incentivized through punishment, not promotions. Inequality reigns and poverty spreads. Obviously, this is a oversimplification, but is it really, Thomas?
Well,
what capitalism is.
Okay, let me start off with a disclaimer. I'm a product of capitalism. I worked for many years. Yeah, I just want to put that up front. For many years, I worked at Madison Avenue as a writer, a producer. I wrote commercials for a number of Fortune 500 companies. So when I do a critique of capitalism, like you start off, there are many different forms. There's crony capitalism, state-owned, state-run capitalism. There's laissez-faire capitalism, and then there's predatory capitalism. And then, of course, there are many more different types. It's an economic form. It's not necessarily a political form, and I think people confuse the two. Capitalism can be a force for good, and I want to make that clear. It also can be a force that's evil, and particularly when you lasso it to the bondage of people and the sale and procurement of people, then it is pernicious. And that's what we had in this country, 17th, 18th century, 19th century, probably. So just, I think we need to lay out the ground rules for what we're talking about with capitalism.
Right. And I think on page 167, they start to talk about this. The author of this essay, this chapter, talking about slavery shaped our political institutions and founding documents. By the eve of the Civil War, the Mississippi Valley was home to more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the United States. Of course, as a result of or I love use the word enslaved camps. The idea that, and whether it was monopolies, whether it was exploitation of workers, both white and Black and Latino and everybody else, whether it was going into the late 19th century into the 20th century, this whole idea of the foundation for our economic system is built upon the use of labor and the exploitation of resources. And the whole idea is the less you pay workers, the people who do the work, you can profit, you can increase your profits. And I just thought it was really interesting when they talk about how we began to creating this idea of this financial system in this country, going back to, well, everything from the plantations in quotes, all the way up to what you just talked about in the last chapter, the northern mills that process the cotton. So it's really interesting here is when they talk about American slavery is necessarily imprinted on the DNA of American capitalism, because you talk about how basically everything started, the very foundation of our growth as a nation. You can almost trace it back to the way we exploited Africans and the way we exploited resources. And
there's
to take off from there.
Yeah, there's also another way of looking at this, which I just thought about. You could look at what happened in the war between the states as a transfer of wealth. The South was immeasurably richer than the North. And as you know, the 13 colonies, when they took on, for example, the debt that they had after the Revolutionary War, the South was in pretty damn good shape. And it was those northern colonies, the northeastern colonies, that had to amass the debt. And part of what they were negotiating was, with Alexander Hamilton was trying to get through, was you take on, all of us take on that debt equally. The South was against that because, hey, they were sitting pretty high. And one of the wonderful things I love in the play Hamilton is when Thomas Jefferson comes back. And he is, he's like, hey, why should we take on that debt?
Right.
We are doing damn well down here.
Yeah.
And they were. So, but the war between the South and the North, in a lot of ways, was a transfer of wealth because the South would never, ever reach the pinnacle of the North again. And a lot of it had to do with the slaves. What happened is their inventory was taken away from them.
Right.
Their inventory, in many instances, got them left, walked out the door, when they could. Although, that's an oversimplification because in the aftermath of the Civil War and the aftermath of Reconstruction, basically what they did was they had sharecropping. They had the chain gangs, which they had, forced labor. Again, it just wasn't getting the same name. People in theory, and it was only in theory, were no longer slaves. They were workers who were in bondage and had to work for whatever they were given. And it gets us back to, I think, the whole issue of capital and labor. It gets us back to that point.
Right. I don't want to get too heavily into a couple of these pages, but people really should pay attention to 168 and 169 in this chapter where they talk about when the Constitution was being written and this idea of, I'll just start off with the line here. When the revolution began, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, but during the 1770s, voices condemning human bondage had grown louder throughout New England and Britain. And it goes on to talk about how they had to make compromises, including the so-called Great Compromise, where they had to compromise to the South and gave enslaved Black people each Black person was counted as 3/5 of a citizen. But it also goes on to talk about taxes and the idea of how to tax property, in this case, slaves. So I don't want to take too much time on this part, but I think it's really important to understanding the beginnings of this country and how we basically gave the South a lot of power at the beginning of this country, which they exploited right up until the the 19th century, and and how enslaved Black workers were treated. I think it's really important to look at this beginning, because it's really sort of, as the historian said, it's in the DNA of this country, that we're going to treat, coming right to the present day, we're going to treat workers as just another line on the ledger. And whatever we can do to get away with paying them less, the better. Although we might pretty it up a little bit. Oh, well, but we offer them benefits. In the meantime, CEOs are getting paid 150 times more than the worker. So I'll just leave that right there. If you want to have any thoughts about that.
Well, I just want to go back to something. And that is, of course, labor formed unions to basically equal the playing field, level the playing field between the capitalists. But that was a very dysfunctional relationship when you really look at it, because what the ruling class was able to do was to divide, and they did that very early on. And the unions were bought into it.
Right.
Unions were restricted to being white.
Yes. Yes.
And
can I just stop you there for a second? Because I really want to spend more time on that issue for a second. But I thought that before we get to that, we talk a little bit about private property. Because that it says in the book here, 171, private property is a cornerstone of capitalism. And again, goes back to how we, and then let me just read this here, is it enables a private landowner to fence off natural resources and forests and rivers, assets that originally belonged to no one and were stewarded by the surrounding community, transforming common goods into commodities controlled by a single person or business entity. Capitalism depends on private property, and private property depends on the law. And why this is important for understanding what you're talking about in terms of workers and unions is because there's a whole section here that talks about how the Supreme Courts of the past have basically reinforced that issue over and over again, that corporations can be treated as private persons, that the framers helped create a doctrine of private property strong enough to justify and enforce human trafficking, so much that abolitionists publicly burned copies of the Constitution. The importance of this specific kind of private property enslaved people with both enshrined in the Constitution itself and affirmed by the Supreme Court's interpretation of the highest law of the land. And they used this as a basis for basically also fighting unions in the future, because a corporation could basically do whatever it wants. I mean, yes, there have been laws protecting union organizing over the years, but the very foundation still is rooted in, this is my corporation, this is my property, this is my private property, and I can do with it whatever I want. And it's starting with enslaved people, but hell, it
actually started from the formation of this country, because when the Constitution, only landowners could vote.
Right.
We get blacks, we get Native Americans, we get all the other stuff. Only those who own land were capable of voting. And that has that's been liberalized to some degree, up throughout. It took the 60s for you to have voting rights for all people.
Right.
And of course, there's now going to be voter suppression. But that is the reality. The country has not been a democracy for 50 years, maybe 50 years we've been a democracy. That to me, we talk about we're the oldest democracy on the face of the earth. I
That's just not
question that.
true.
And
Yeah.
I really question that because we are not. We're not a democracy up until the mid 1960s. So, but again, we're talking two different things. We're talking democracy versus capitalism, and they're intertwined in many ways in this country, but they can also should be separated too.
I'm looking for, there's a line in here. It didn't take, this is about the 14th Amendment that was formed. Well, there was a couple of amendments. The Fifth Amendment, which prohibited Congress from depriving anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process. And yet that was used to inform the Supreme Court's decision to uphold slavery in the infamous 1857 Dred Scott versus Stanford case. But then it goes down and talks about the 14th Amendment. And it didn't take long for corporate attorneys to realize that the 14th Amendment could help strengthen business interests too. The Supreme Court, in a case that's dating back to 1886, believed that the 14th Amendment applied to corporations as well as people. And then, of course, goes on to talk about Citizens United as another example. And this is only recent 2010. So the point here is, in the end, the corporations, ruling caste, the capitalist class, continues to have the power that it has because there's constantly been rulings which basically reinforces this whole idea of private property, about who's, the Supreme Court today is doing the same thing. And a lot of it is damaging to this idea of equality, or actually fostering inequality in this country. So I'll just sort of leave it there. Excuse me. Talk a little bit about land. There's quite a bit of discussion here about how land plays, again, back to private property, and how buying up this land contributed to, again, in this idea is this culture of acquiring wealth without work, growing at all costs, and abusing the powerless. But one of the important things was that we had to, in order for cotton planters to do what they do, they had to acquire more and more land as part of the movement of capitalist labor and products across long distances. And this is something that happens today. And now you were in redevelopment and you saw this idea of how important property was in the development. In fact, you spoke a little bit about it in the last chapter, how the control of property is really important for the development of local economies. So talk a little bit about your experience with private property.
Well, let's get to to start at the base of it. Most people's wealth is tied up in their property. And that generally tends to be a single family dwelling. We start with that basis. That's the average American has the bulk of their family wealth is their home. And if you look at why African Americans lag far behind white Americans, it has to do with practices that were ingrained in federal law. And I'll just start with, let's start with contemporary times. After World War II, when veterans came back from fighting, there was a GI Bill. The GI Bill had one component was, of course, GI loans. It was also this whole thing of land, getting homes for GIs, returning vets. There's a place in New York, Levittown, I think it's New York.
Yeah. Yes.
Levittown, which was built with subsidized money. And it was also built primarily for the returning GIs. We'll start with the fact that Black Americans, in fact, only white Americans could live there. Those loans were subsidized by the federal government. So they started off with a toehold into getting wealth that was denied other people. But put that aside, in the areas where people of color lived, the federal government, as well as corporations, denied them insurance. Banks would not loan to them, which is, if you want to know why certain areas look like they do, you can put it to those two things. Insurance was not allowed, or insurance was denied. Loans would not be given out. And then there was also the thing of zoning. And zoning is a result of city governments and often state governments. We start with probably the biggest thing, which is whenever you want to bring a road in, a highway, a freeway, where did you put it? You put it in neighborhoods of color. And those neighborhoods would be uprooted. Businesses that form would be basically taken out, giving minimum return on what they had built up over generations. Those people who own homes were essentially forced to become renters now. And what you have now is a highway project which allows certain people to go to certain jobs, which those people whose homes and businesses were taken out could not have those jobs because you had job discrimination. And then because you do have this thing of uprootedness, and you have these families who are now basically forced into often urban centers with minimum infrastructure, with no services or few services. So now you've got, and might I add, joblessness. So what are you going to have? You're going to have crime.
Right.
And that crime is a result of that social upheaval. So I'm convinced that there's nothing accidental about this. This was government policy, which is, and this gets us back to what happens with redevelopment. Now, recently, redevelopment has gotten more equitable because of certain laws were passed that you had to compensate people for their land. But if you notice, one of the things that happened, particularly when they started taking land out of white communities and giving it to corporations, suddenly you had court rulings that basically prohibited it. That was never prohibited when it was primarily people of color's land being taken. And then we can also, I'm jumping back and forth, but this also has its roots in the taking of Native American land.
Right.
One of the things you read about was, those farmers who wanted to plant cotton. They essentially removed natives, kicked them out.
Right.
The federal government bought that
expansion.
land, expansion, and then sold it at ridiculously low prices to only certain people who happen to be
Right.
And that allowed, and then again, that's generation of wealth. It's generated, the federal government embeds it. And so when we say, well, how come those people don't have the same wealth or the standard of living isn't equivalent to white people? There's a reason, and it's intentional.
Yeah. And I thought it was interesting because in the last chapter, as well as this chapter, this whole idea of, particularly after Reconstruction, where, farmers, Black farmers, but, people who had the little plots of land would be terrorized to leave their plot of land. The wife for the story in one of the other chapters, the white farmer who just couldn't stand the idea of his neighbor who was Black having more land than him, and then he moved the boundary line. And the bottom line is they basically chased the family off their land. So all this land, that the wealth of this land could have been passed down, and of course, it wasn't because it didn't belong to them anymore.
Let's take an example of something that happened here in Southern California. Manhattan Beach, as you know, is a very wealthy enclave.
Right.
You had a Black family, which owned property that was on the ocean. In fact, what they had done was they had bought the property and they were developing it for other families to come in, because they were denied the ability to go to beaches elsewhere.
Right.
So this family bought up that particular a large plot of land on the ocean. The city of Manhattan Beach did an eminent domain. And they claimed they were doing it because they needed parks. Of course, that land sat vacant for close to 40 years. The family was kicked out. They were given minimal, and I mean minimal, compensation. Now, just recently, the state has admitted that that was illegal, and they have returned that land, that parcel, to that family.
Upsetting a lot of people in Manhattan Beach.
Of course it has. Of course it has. But they only returned it to them. What they didn't compensate them for was the loss of the use of their land for 40 years while Manhattan Beach built up all around them. $1 million house in Manhattan Beach you can find was a shack.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So you consider what they could have accumulated. And that, frankly, is only one small example. There are multiple examples I can tell you where land was illegally taken from people of color and given to someone else.
And that's the contradiction. Like, it just blows me away, because on the one hand, as was said here, that capitalism rests so much on private property, but when it's to their advantage,
well, of course,
when
it
it's
does.
not to their advantage, they just find a way to either steal it or buy it, but a forced buy.
Yeah. One of the things that this chapter said, and this bears a lot of bears repeating, it talked about it for landowners is the rule of law is extremely important, because you can have land, but if you have a rule of law, someone can come and take your land. Someone can say, "Oh, the boundaries that you established are not accurate," and just simply do it. So it's very much a case that you can't have land ownership where you don't have a rule of law.
Right.
But unfortunately, for people of color who own land, the courts did not recognize their ownership. And if it did, what happened is it was easy for a court, which was basically the judge was white, the jury is white. You had no chance. And that is how much of the land, particularly blacks on farms in the South, was taken away. One last example, and I know about this, my family to this day still owns land in Alabama farm. And I can't tell you how hard they worked to keep it. But one of the things I did know was that when their farmland was next to a white farmer, particularly post-World War II, that farmer was able to get loans for his equipment, for seed, for improvements of his property. This is the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Yeah.
My family was not able to get any of that. They were denied that. And being in Alabama, it wasn't sugarcoated. It was straight out, flat out told, "You're black. You ain't going to get it." And of course, they didn't use the word black, but you aren't going to get it.
Yeah.
And these are the same people that are paying the same amount of taxes as their white owner, the white landowner next to them. So, the scales of justice didn't work very well then, and and going into the day, I don't think it works very well today.
I want to get back to something you started to talk about in terms of unions, and this is on page 181. Talks about slavery and the racism it nourished also played a decisive role in weakening the American labor movement. Instead of resisting, capitalists leveraged slavery and its racial legacy to divide workers, free from unfree, white from black, diluting their collective power. Instead of resisting the strategy, white-led unions embraced it until it was too late, undercutting their movement and creating conditions for worker exploitation and inequality that exists to this day. So I'm from New York.
Mm-hmm.
My father was a teamster. And I remember, this would be going back into the 50s and the 60s. how difficult it was for not just Black people to get into unions, because I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on what they called it, where basically you got into a union as an apprentice because your father was in the union, which is like okay, but if I can't get in the union, how am I going to get my son to be in the union?
Yeah.
And I remember that even for Puerto Ricans, Latinos back then, the same problem, but it was even more pronounced in certain unions, police unions, fire unions, also the same thing for construction. I mean, there were a lot of high-paying jobs, usually during those 50s and 60s, where the unions were very, very powerful in New York. And it was always the same.
What has changed, Antonio?
What's changed?
What's changed? They're still powerful in New York. They're still
City. Powerful, yes,
yes. Particularly those municipal unions of police and fire.
Right.
Public safety, there's no change.
Right. But in terms of construction, I mean, it's gotten better over the years, but we all know that there's still, there's the examples here locally where, what were they called? Agreements that were made that, particularly on public projects, where the idea was to introduce union jobs to people of color, but when there were efforts for local hiring, like Long Beach, for instance, they would say, "Oh no, it's the region." So basically, they try to dilute that power by making it, like Orange County and other places.
They didn't try; they were successful.
Well, they were successful.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
It was a nod. It was a nod to certain unions that were giving money to certain politicians.
Of course, I defy you today. If you look at projects here in the city of Long Beach, where we reside, and you look at those projects and where there are union jobs, to count the number of people of color in those jobs. I also defy you when there's on the city municipal maintenance jobs, construction jobs, these are city employees. Look at the numbers. I will guarantee you that you're going to see it's less than 5%. And it's not just city, but it's pernicious in particularly there, because we're taxpayers that are paying for those jobs. And yet the vast benefit goes to white workers. And as you rightly said, one of the things that happens, even in cities, you get a job in there, you can bring in your relatives, and it happens.
Yes, it's
the same thing happens. You're Black, you try that. Try and see what happens. Bring in your relatives. I mean, and this is the fight that has yet to be fought or yet to be won.
I think this is in these couple of pages where they talk about the divide between white workers viewing Black workers, both free and enslaved, as a threat to their livelihood. Mm-hmm. There was this is post slavery, Civil War, I believe. One example where white mobs throughout the first half of the 19th century, it's actually pre-Civil War, attacked free Black workers in Cincinnati, Philadelphia, New York City, and elsewhere because they were motivated by the hope that running Black people out of town would drive up white wages. And in fact, it didn't. Mm-hmm. In fact, slavery pulled down all workers' wages.
Yes, it did.
Nearly all those unions, this is talking about labor power, had little chance when the bosses could choose to buy people, rent them, contract indentured servants take on apprentices or hired children or prisoners. Without this environment, white workers form labor unions. Within this environment, white workers form labor unions and advocate for better pay, improved conditions, and shorter work days. Yet nearly all these unions withheld membership from free Black workers.
Yeah, I think it's pretty telling. It's another thing, and the book points this out, that in most Western European countries where there are labor unions, you have a labor party.
Right.
Okay, where the worker has some power in the government. You never had anything like that here, and one of the reasons why is, of course, because you had slaves. You started off as slaves. You had Black exploited workers. And what's sad about it is, for the most part, white workers don't understand that concept. I think, and that's what my optimism comes in. I think they're slowly seeping in. I mean, there's a new labor union afoot. And I think those workers understand how they've been played.
Right.
They tend to be younger.
Yes.
There's a wonderful piece on the unionization of Amazon.
Right.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. There's also what's happening in Starbucks. I think we're going to see a revival of that. And part of it is, of course, is the pandemic. But slowly, that whole thing, the bugaboo of Black workers, is slowly going away, but unfortunately too slow.
You know, I guess I heard this at some point, but I guess maybe I've forgotten, but to read it again. So there's a section in 182 and 183. White workers viewed Black people not only as rape busters, but also as political adversaries. Since Black constituencies were generally aligned with the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln and emancipation, but also the party of big business, while white union members sided with the Democratic Party, seen as more sympathetic to labor and immigrants. But what it tries to explain is that part of the reason was, to Black workers, strike breaking was as a means to gain a foothold in the growing industrial economy and secure opportunities long denied them. So Black leaders often encouraged strike breaking and began promoting Black workers as safe investments for industrialists, because that was the only way they were going to get into the labor force. So the unions basically cut off their nose to spite their face, because if they had connected with Black workers, they would have strengthened
their power.
Their power.
Yeah.
And they didn't.
There is the example of World War II. The workers there were Black workers who were in those factories, that when white workers came back after the war, guess who lost their jobs? Guess who got the jobs? And there was some violence. There was quite a fair amount of violence over that.
Yeah.
And there was also exclusion. It was exclusion of Blacks into those jobs. And one of them was on the automobile factory floor.
Right, yes.
There were fights. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about violent fights. To kick out Blacks. And it wasn't until, like, again, the 60s, when you had the Great Migration, the latter part of the Great Migration, when Blacks were able to once again get a toehold in the automobile industry, which frankly was a little too late, because you had the white flight from Detroit, which started in the 60s. And those factories that had supported with good paying jobs started going either overseas, or they started, the people who left went to, the suburbs. And with them went a lot of those services and those jobs. And the one last thing on this whole thing about unions and Black workers, white workers, and particularly the transition of Blacks from the Republican Party to whites from the Republican Party, whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. I think LBJ summed it up pretty well when he signed the Civil Rights Bill, giving Blacks and other people the right to vote. He made a statement. He a Southern understood this better than anyone. He said, I'm signing this because it's the right thing to do, but we just lost for a
White
couple of
vote.
generations, the white vote. And he was so correct, because what happened is, what was in their best economic interest was overridden by their fear of blacks. And it's not just fear, it's disdain of blacks.
Which explains what has happened over the last 6 years.
Of course.
From 2016 and the election, the Trump campaign. I'm just blown away. There's a great line in here, because it just blows me away how many blue collar workers vote for the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because as it says here, up at the top where they talk about white union members who sided with the Democratic Party were seen as more sympathetic to labor and immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
That is not true today. It's the other way around.
Of course.
But the line that just blows me away is, given the choice between parity with Black people by inviting them into unified unions and poverty, white workers chose poverty, spoiling the development of a multiracial mass labor movement in America, which is what is happening today. They would rather side with the bosses, the industrialists.
But it's a little more complicated than that. I mean, that's a huge part.
But at the root of it is this fear of immigrants, and the idea of working with
those
people of color. Those people.
And that's clearly at the root of it. But I think there's another thing too that goes with it, which drives my wife crazy, and it is this. Most people in this country, when they look at the very wealthy, this inequality of income, they don't say, damn, how can a CEO make 150 times what the worker on the floor makes? What they say is, one day I'm going to get to that place. And one day I'm going to be just like him. And I say him intentionally, because it often is, it's more likely to be a white male than not. And there's this aspirational thing. Of course, it ain't going to happen. The likelihood of it happening is,
it's like saying, I'm going to win that $500 million lottery.
I think you've got a more chance of doing that than ending up in a CEO position. And if for no other reason, that most of the people in CEO jobs, first of all, go to certain schools, which is unlikely you're going to get in those schools, because of legacy. Let's just face it, legacy and all of that. But even beyond that, much of the wealth in this country was inherited. And people take that wealth and they built something else beyond that. If you look at most of those folks.
You mean like Elon Musk?
Yeah, it is that they were already, there are a few, there are a few, and most of whom are in the tech industry. But there was some tech industry also built on family fortune. But even beyond that, those who were not built on family fortune, if you look at the schools they went to, they were able to get into those schools, and those schools are not, by and large, on their own qualification. A lot of it was legacy. And frankly, part of how wealth is accumulated in this country, wealth is built, is who you know. And if you go to those schools, the likelihood of you meeting someone is greater than if you go to, let's face it, a public school.
Yeah.
So that's how a lot of wealth is built.
But it's funny. It's not just that people think they're going to hit the lottery, but there's this idea that I'm going to work hard at my job, and one day I'm going to be the floor manager. I'm going to be the shift manager. And which are all great goals. We should all work to that. But this idea, if everything was equal, as we would like to believe, you wouldn't have people filing discrimination cases.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't be hearing reports constantly about people who are promoted with less service to the company than their co-worker who's been there for 20 years because based on their color. I just think that, and of course the courts over time have made it even more difficult for people to sue and prove that. Because, according to Chief Justice Roberts, there is no more racism in America. I want to end with, if you have your book in front of you.
Yes.
Page 185. This is the last page in this chapter on capitalism. And the last paragraph, which starts with, America has evolved into one of the world's most inequitable societies. Do you mind reading a couple of those sentences and I'll finish it up?
Well, it's kind of obvious. Today, the richest 10% of Americans own over 75% of the country's wealth. The top 1% owning well over a third. Many of the political systems, legal arrangements, cultural beliefs, and economic structures that uphold and promote this level of inequality trace their roots back to slavery and its aftermath. If America today promotes a particular kind of low-road capitalism, a union-busting capitalism of poverty wages, gig jobs, and normalized insecurity, a winner-take-all capitalism of stunning disparities, not only permitting, but rewarding financial rule bending, a racist capitalism that ignores the fact that slavery didn't just deny Black freedom, but built white fortunes, originating the Black-white wealth gap that annually grows wider. One reason is that American capitalism is founded on the lowest road there is. And that sums up, that's a great summary.
Yeah. I just think that, and what I always fear as we finish up here, as I always fear is when you read this, how those who would deny that this even exists as part of our history, would use these words to turn around. One of the criticisms of this chapter and of this book in general is this idea that, this is, communists and socialists talking, and this is people who are against our way of I've got a jet coming over my house. This idea that questioning the roots of an economic system that is obviously unequal is somehow politically we're foreigners to do that. We're communists. And it just never. And as I always continue to say, is we are never ever going to change until we confront both the truth in front of us and the truth in our history.
Yeah. I just would leave you with one recommendation. I listened to the Ezra Klein show, and there is Ta-Nehisi Coates and Hannah Jones are interviewed on it, and a lot of the conversation is about the backlash to this book. They have some interesting perspectives on that, and I think they're pretty right on. It's not an argument against the historical accuracy of what is in this book. It is a backlash against the fact that it destroys and disrupts the myth that we have set ourselves upon, which is that, this shining city on this hill. You can't be a shining city on a hill when in the shadows you have people in chains. And furthermore, the fact that we're talking about the historical founding of this country in a true light does not distract from the greatness of those words, all men are created equal, the greatness of the words in the Constitution, the greatness of the words in the Declaration of Independence. What we're asking the country to do, and people in it, to live up to those words, aspire to, and that's what this book is doing. it's shining a light so that people can say, okay, this is what we were. Now, what will we be?
What do we want to be?
Yeah.
And that's where I will share some optimism with you on that, is that I think that the generations that are coming up now know that and see that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is why such a backlash against some of the things that we're seeing today coming from younger people who are leading the charge. So I will leave you with that optimism. And as you well know, I'm not much of an optimist.
I'm glad to hear optimism coming from your side of the camera.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very much. We're going to be talking about politics in the next chapter of the 1619 Project podcast. My name is Antonio Ruiz. Thomas Fields is my compatriot over here. Let's see you again. Thank you.
See you again. Bye.